I'll never forget that day. We'd just gotten a call about some hikers who hadn't come back from their trip. They'd gone up the mountain 2 days earlier, but with the storm that hit, they were already overdue by hours. My team and I, 6 of us, were trained for this kind of thing, search and rescue in rough conditions, but we all knew a snowstorm up in the mountains was no joke. The wind was brutal, whipping snow into our faces, stinging and cold. Every breath felt like breathing ice. We geared up, double-checking our equipment, while I went over the plan. I was the team leader, so it was on me to make sure everyone stayed safe, no matter what. The others counted on me to keep a level head, even though I felt a strange chill that wasn't just from the snow. Something felt off, but I kept it to myself. The trail was already buried, so we relied on the map and compass, taking one careful step after another. Visibility was terrible, we could barely see a few feet in front of us. I had to shout over the howling wind just to give directions. The storm kept pushing us back, and the deeper we went, the worse it got. But there was no turning back. There were people out there, waiting for us to find them. I kept reminding myself and the team why we were here. These hikers were someone's family, friends. We were all hoping they'd just found shelter somewhere, hunkered down, waiting for help. But with every step, I couldn't shake that feeling in my gut. Something about this mission felt different. And soon I'd learn why. We pushed on, moving slowly through the snow that seemed to be falling even thicker now. After what felt like hours, one of my team members, Ben, suddenly stopped and pointed down. "Mike. Look," he said, his voice tense. I looked where he was pointing. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just more snow and ice. But then I noticed it. Dark red stains in the snow, barely visible under a fresh layer of powder. Footprints covered in patches of blood. We couldn't tell if it was from an animal or one of the hikers, but something about it didn't sit right. And then, as we followed the tracks, they just stopped. One moment there were footprints, and then nothing, as if whoever made them had just disappeared. "Where could they have gone?" Sarah, another team member, whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I shook my head, trying to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the storm had wiped out the rest of the trail, or maybe they'd turned around and the wind had filled in the tracks behind them. But it felt wrong, like something was missing. We kept moving, our eyes scanning the snow for any more signs. That's when Ben muttered, "Mike, the compass." I pulled mine out and frowned. The needle was spinning wildly, not pointing north or anywhere at all. Just going in circles, as if it didn't know which way was up anymore. It didn't make any sense. We were experienced with this kind of work. We knew how to handle the mountain, even in a storm, but this. It felt like the mountain was playing tricks on us. "Stick together," I told the team, my voice as steady as I could keep it. "We don't take a single step alone, understood?" They all nodded, but I could see the worry in their eyes. We kept moving, but I noticed everyone glancing over their shoulders. I did too. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. And then, in the distance, through the thick snow, I saw something. It was big, moving slowly, just a shadow in the blizzard. At first I thought it was a tree or a trick of the light. But then it moved again, stepping through the snow. It looked like a person, but far too tall, too big. I felt my heart start to race. Whatever it wasn't any hiker. "Keep moving," I said, hoping my voice sounded calmer than I felt. "We're going to find these hikers, and we're going to get out of here." But deep down, I had a feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. We pushed forward, each of us keeping close, every step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow moving through the snow. I kept telling myself it had to be some kind of trick, just my eyes playing games in the storm. But I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. The whole team seemed on edge, glancing around like they expected something to jump out at us any second. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a scream. It was Ben. "Ben," I yelled, whipping around, but he was gone. Just gone. 1 second he'd been there, right beside me, and the next nothing. Only the howling wind and snow swirling around us. "Ben," I shouted again, my voice barely cutting through the wind. I scanned the area, my heart pounding. The rest of the team was looking too, panic in their eyes. But all we saw was empty snow. No footprints, no sign of him, just. Fear started to creep in, that kind of fear you can't talk yourself out of. I kept my voice steady, telling the others to stay close. "Nobody wanders off, you hear me? Not a step away from each other." But before we could even move, we heard another scream. This time it was Sarah. I whipped around again, but she was nowhere to be seen either. Just empty snow stretching on forever. It was like the mountain was swallowing them up, one by one, right under our noses. My team was disappearing, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Everyone stay together. Keep moving forward, I ordered, gripping my radio tight. I knew I needed to keep calm, but inside I was terrified. The storm felt like it was closing in on us, like something out there was watching every move we made. Please, don't leave me, one of the younger members, Josh whispered, his voice trembling. I put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it tight. We're going to be okay, I lied. We're going to find Ben and Sarah, and we're going to get out of here. But as we trudged through the snow, that shadow reappeared. It moved, slow and steady, closer this time. And in that moment I knew whatever was out there, it was hunting us. And it wasn't planning to let any of us go. After losing Ben and Sarah, none of us could even think straight. We just kept moving, hoping we'd somehow get out of there or at least find some kind of answer to what was happening. My whole team was counting on me to lead them, but I didn't have any answers. I just kept telling them to keep going, even though I felt just as scared as they did. The storm only got worse, the snow swirling so thick around us that it felt like we were trapped inside a white wall. Then, finally, we stumbled upon something, a small clearing sheltered by a cluster of trees. And there, huddled together in the snow, we saw them, the missing hikers. I felt a rush of relief we'd finally found them. But as I got closer, my relief turned to horror. They weren't moving. They were sitting there, backs against each other, all curled up like they'd tried to keep warm. But their faces, they were frozen solid, their skin pale, their eyes open wide, staring into the distance. It was like they'd seen something that scared them to death. Whatever happened to them, it hadn't been fast. They'd frozen out here, alone and terrified, probably waiting for help that never came. The others saw it too, and I heard someone gasp behind me. We all stood there, staring at these poor people, frozen in the snow, and for the first time I felt truly hopeless. If we didn't get out soon, we were going to end up just like them. I felt a lump in my throat, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to keep it together for the team. We need to keep moving, I said, my voice low and steady. Whatever's out here, it's not done with us yet. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again, that same shadow, moving just beyond the clearing, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. It knew we were here, and it wasn't going to let us leave. After finding the hikers like that, frozen and lifeless, my team was silent. Nobody dared speak. We all just kept moving, hoping somehow to escape whatever was stalking us. I could tell they were all looking to me for answers, but deep down, I had no idea what we were up against. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, or we'd end up just like those hikers. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise behind us, a low, rumbling sound like heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. I turned, and for the first time I got a clear look at it. It was tall, towering over the trees, like a person but far too big. Its body was covered in ragged, icy fur, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, cold and unblinking. It stared at us, as if it was studying us, deciding who it would take next. I felt my stomach drop. This thing, it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and cold, like it belonged to the storm itself. Before I could even react, it lunged forward, fast and silent. In seconds, another member of my team was gone, yanked into the blizzard without a sound. My heart was racing, and I grabbed Josh, pulling him forward. "Run," I yelled. "Don't look back, just run." We stumbled and fell through the snow, half blinded by the storm, with the sound of that thing's footsteps thundering somewhere behind us. I couldn't tell if it was close or far, but it didn't matter. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, no matter what. Then, one by one, the rest of my team was taken, pulled away by the shadow and the storm, until it was just me, alone in the freezing cold. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with fear and exhaustion, but somehow I kept going. I could still hear it behind me, the faint crunch of snow, always just a little too close. Finally, after what felt like hours, the storm began to lift, and I saw the lights of our base camp ahead. I stumbled forward, falling into the snow, gasping for air. When I looked back, the storm was gone, and so was that thing, like it had vanished into thin air. I was the only one who made it back, the only one left to tell the story. I tried to explain what happened, but nobody believed me. They thought I'd lost my mind, that I'd imagined it all in the snowstorm. But I know what I saw, and even now, sometimes I hear it, that low, rumbling sound, like footsteps in the snow, just waiting for the next group of unlucky souls to wander into its path. I still remember the day like it was yesterday. Alaska was freezing, but the kind of freezing that makes you feel alive. I'd been caving for years, exploring places most people would never dream of. The wild, the unknown, that's what pulled me in every time. That day, I had two young guides with me, Andy and Jake. They were both in their 20s, excited and nervous. It was their first real trip like this, and I could see the thrill in their eyes. I told them to keep close and to pay attention to every sound and every shadow. Out here, that kind of focus could be the difference between life and death. We were deep in the wilderness, far from any town or help. The mountains stretched endlessly, covered in snow and ice. The wind was a constant whisper, almost like it was talking to us, or warning us. The plan was simple: find caves, mark them, and explore the unknown. I'd done it dozens of times before, but something about this trip felt different, like an itch in the back of my mind. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, there's always a bit of fear when you're stepping into the unknown. Then we found a new cave, hidden behind layers of ice and snow. I was thrilled, thinking we might be the first people to ever step inside. Little did I know, this cave would be like nothing I'd ever experienced before. The cave entrance was just wide enough for us to slip through, barely more than a crack in the icy wall. I went first, squeezing my way in and shining my flashlight around. Andy and Jake followed close behind, their breaths visible in little clouds. Inside, the walls were made of thick ice that seemed to glow a soft blue light. It was beautiful but cold, biting cold, or at least it should have been. That's when I noticed something strange. The deeper we went, the warmer it got. I stopped and looked back at Andy and Jake, who were just as puzzled. Anyone else feel that I asked, my voice barely above a whisper? They nodded, looking around. The air was thick, almost like the cave was breathing along with us. I could feel my skin prickling, not from cold, but from the strange warmth. This doesn't make sense, I muttered, almost to myself. We're surrounded by ice, but it's warm. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the path ahead. We kept moving, slowly, cautiously, with nothing but our flashlights to light the way. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, making strange patterns in the ice that twisted and turned, like faces frozen in mid-scream. It was probably just shadows, but I kept glancing over my shoulder anyway. After what felt like hours, we came across something unexpected: a pile of old camping gear. It looked like it had been here for years, maybe even decades. Tattered sleeping bags, a dented metal pot, even a rusty lantern. But something was off. There were dark stains on the gear, splattered here and there. I knelt down to take a closer look, and my stomach twisted. It was dried blood. "Who would camp here?" Andy whispered, his voice shaky. He was staring at the stains with wide eyes, his hands clutching his flashlight like it was the only thing keeping him safe. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever happened here, it wasn't good. I told myself to stay calm, but the uneasy feeling was growing stronger by the second. We stood there for a while, just staring at the old, bloody camping gear. I could feel my heart beating faster, but I tried to keep calm. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe the blood was old, or maybe it was from an animal. I didn't want to scare Andy and Jake, but I could tell they were already shaken. Then we heard a sound that echoed through the cave, low and distant. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, but it almost sounded like a scream. Not a loud scream, just faint and far away, bouncing off the icy walls. We all froze, listening. What was that?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide. I didn't know. It didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before, and we were miles from any other people. My mind raced, trying to come up with something that made sense, but the sound sent chills down my spine. It was too human to ignore. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But as soon as I said it, I knew it didn't sound like the wind. We heard it again, a little closer this time, and it made my skin crawl. Andy pulled out the radio we'd brought for emergencies. "Maybe we should call for backup," he suggested, his voice tight. I nodded, glad he had the same idea. But when he tried to turn it on, there was nothing. Just silence. He shook it, tapped it, but the radio was completely dead. A nervous laugh escaped Jake. So, we're just in the middle of nowhere, in a warm ice cave, with who knows what screaming in the dark. He tried to make it sound like a joke, but there was fear in his voice. We were all feeling it, that growing sense that something wasn't right. We kept walking, trying to ignore the heavy silence. Every step felt like it was leading us deeper into something we couldn't turn back from. I kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see someone or something following. Then, the echoes started again, louder this time, closer. And this time it didn't just sound like a scream. It sounded like something moving, dragging itself through the dark. We all moved closer together, barely daring to breathe. The echoes in the cave had taken on a strange rhythm, like something big was dragging itself toward us. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I knew the others were feeling the same. We had no idea what was out there, but we all knew we had to be careful. This wasn't just an empty cave. We weren't alone. Maybe we should head back, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. Both Andy and Jake nodded quickly, looking relieved. We turned around, ready to retrace our steps back to the entrance. But the sound didn't stop. It was getting louder, and somehow it was closer. We hurried along, our flashlights barely piercing the thick darkness. The walls seemed to close in on us, the air feeling heavier with each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that we were just spooking ourselves. Then it happened. Andy, who was right behind me, let out a yell, stumbling forward. I spun around to see his flashlight skidding across the ice. He was being pulled backward, hands clawing at the ground, eyes wide with terror. "Help me," he screamed, his voice echoing through the cave. Jake and I lunged forward, grabbing his arms, pulling with all our strength. But whatever had him was too strong. Andy's grip started slipping, and with one last, desperate look at us, he was yanked into the darkness, his scream fading as quickly as he disappeared. Jake and I were frozen, our minds racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. But there was no time to think. We had to get out of there, now. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. We didn't look back. We sprinted through the cave, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the shadows stretching and twisting around us. But the feeling of being chased, of something huge and unseen right behind us, was stronger than ever. We ran as fast as we could, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness ahead. I could feel the weight of the cave pressing down on us, every shadow and sound making me jump. But there was no time to stop, no time to think about what had just happened to Andy. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. Jake was breathing hard beside me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. I could see him looking around like he expected Andy to come running back to us any second. But deep down, I think we both knew that wasn't going to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Jake stumbled, his foot catching on something hidden in the ice. He fell, his flashlight spinning out of his hand, leaving him in total darkness. Jake, I dropped to my knees, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him up. But he just sat there, staring down at his hands. They were turning blue, frozen solid, like he'd been holding ice for hours. His skin looked pale, almost white, and frost was forming on his fingers. I can't feel my hands," he whispered, his voice shaking. He looked up at me, his eyes filling with panic. "Sarah, what's happening to me?" I had no idea. He had been fine just a second ago, but now it was like he was freezing from the inside out. I tried to help him up, to get him to his feet, but his whole body had started to stiffen, like he was turning into a statue. "Jake, we have to go," I pleaded, tugging at him, but it was no use. His face was frozen in fear, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth open in a silent scream. He wasn't moving anymore. He was just frozen, like a solid block of ice. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe, watching my last friend disappear right before my eyes. Whatever had done this to Jake and to Andy was still out there, and I was next. I had no choice. I turned and ran, leaving Jake behind, my heart pounding as I raced through the cave, hoping that somehow I could make it out alive. I ran, barely able to keep my flashlight steady. My whole body was shaking, and my breath came in short, gasping bursts. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, as if the cave itself was alive, watching every step I took. The sounds were back, the dragging, scraping noise coming from somewhere behind me. It was louder now, getting closer, filling the cave with an awful echo. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I saw whatever was chasing me, I might freeze up like Jake. I had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, even though my legs were weak and my heart felt like it might burst. Then, just as I thought I'd outrun it, I saw something ahead, a dim light flickering in the darkness. For a second, I thought I was seeing things, but then I realized it was the faint glow from the entrance. Relief washed over me. I was almost out. I just had to reach that light. But as I got closer, a horrifying sight stopped me in my tracks. There, just on the edge of the light, was it. A huge, shadowy shape crouched over what was left of Andy and Jake. It was hunched and twisted, its limbs too long, its movements slow and heavy, like it was savoring its meal. I froze, watching in horror as it lifted its head, sniffing the air. It hadn't seen me yet, but I knew that could change any second. I felt trapped, helpless, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but fear kept me rooted in place. Finally, with every bit of courage I had left, I took a slow step back. My foot made the tiniest crunch against the ice. The creature stopped, turning its head toward me. Its eyes, dark, empty, and bottomless, locked onto mine. That was it. I didn't wait for another second. I turned and ran, sprinting as fast as I could toward the entrance, barely making it out before the creature could follow. I didn't stop running until I was far from the cave, where I collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. I made it out. But the image of that thing, its dark eyes and the sight of my friends, would haunt me forever. That cave would stay hidden, and I knew I'd never go near it again. I stumbled through the snow, my legs weak and barely holding me up. The silence outside was almost too loud after all the echoes and strange sounds in the cave. The air was freezing again, but I barely felt it. I just kept moving, needing to get as far away as possible. Every step felt like I was waking up from a nightmare, but I knew this was real. Too real. Eventually, I reached the camp where we'd started. I fell to my knees, struggling to catch my breath, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly zip my coat back up. I looked back at the mountains, at the hidden entrance to that cave, now barely visible from where I stood. I knew there was no going back. Whatever was in there could stay buried. I didn't want to tell anyone, didn't want to remember. But the images wouldn't leave me. Andy's scream, Jake's frozen face, the creature crouched in the shadows. I managed to reach the nearest ranger station the next day, though I didn't tell them everything. Just that we got lost, that my guides were missing. They searched, of course, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The cave didn't want to be found, and part of me was glad. The mountains were vast and unforgiving, and that creature was just one part of their darkness. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see it, the endless ice, the shadows, that awful shape moving in the dark. And I wonder if someday someone else will find that cave, curious and brave like we were. And I pray they won't make it as far as we did. I never thought working in a fire lookout tower would be so lonely. It's just me, a tiny room, and a view of endless trees stretching in every direction. The forest is beautiful, but there's something unsettling about the way it feels when you're this high up, surrounded by nothing but the silence and the dark. They assigned me this tower for the season, and I thought I'd enjoy it. A peaceful job, with just me and my radio, keeping an eye out for smoke and flames. It's supposed to be quiet out here. Maybe even boring. Most nights, all I can hear are the distant calls of owls or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. My only real company is Ben, the guy who works the other tower just a few miles off. We talk over the radio when we can, passing the time with stories and jokes. But tonight feels different. The air is too still, and the silence has weight to it, like the forest itself is holding its breath. I find myself glancing over my shoulder, checking the dark corners of the room, as if something might be hiding there. It's silly, I tell myself. This job has always been safe, and it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, there's an itch in the back of my head, a feeling I can't shake. I take a deep breath and look out the window at the forest below, hoping for some kind of distraction. And that's when I see it, the first flicker of light down in the trees. Small but definitely moving. The light in the forest below catches my eye, and at first I think maybe it's a group of campers. Sometimes people sneak into restricted areas to set up tents, despite all the signs warning them to stay out. But as I watch, I realize this light isn't like a campfire or a flashlight beam. It's small, almost like a firefly, but brighter, and it's moving strangely, drifting in odd loops and swirls that make my stomach twist. I reach for my radio, calling over to Ben's tower. Ben? You there? My voice is steady, but my hand feels a bit shaky. After a moment, his voice crackles back. Yeah, I'm here. What's up? I see. Something. A light in the forest, maybe half a mile out. I can't tell what it is, but it's weird. You see anything from your end? There's a pause. Nope, not a thing. Could be just a reflection, or someone lost with a flashlight. You want me to come over and check it out? I think about saying yes, but it feels silly to bother him over something so small. It's probably nothing. I just got spooked for no reason. No, it's fine, I say finally. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Ben laughs. If you are, then we both are. Call me if it gets stranger, okay? I set the radio down, but keep my eyes on the light below. It's still there. And now there are two of them, twisting together like they're dancing. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I've been out here alone too long, and my mind's making something out of nothing. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the lights blink out, leaving the forest pitch dark again. That's when I hear it. A faint, distant scream coming through the radio. My heart skips a beat. I grab the radio, holding it close to my ear, straining to make out any other sounds. The scream was faint, like it was far away, but it was there. I'm not imagining it. I press the button. Ben, did you hear that? There's a long silence, and for a second, I think maybe the radio's cut out. But then Ben's voice comes through, sounding tense. Yeah, I heard it. Probably just an animal, though. You know how sound travels weird out here at night. He sounds calm, but there's an edge in his voice. I can tell he's not as relaxed as he's trying to sound. I'm not either. Yeah, maybe I say, though I don't believe it. I know the sounds animals make. This sounded human. I glance out the window again, and there, deep in the trees, are the lights. But now, they're closer, maybe a quarter mile away, bobbing and weaving between the trees, moving in a way that feels wrong. It's like they're looking for something. I try to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. Then I say into the radio, those lights, they're back, and they're getting closer. Ben doesn't respond right away. When he finally speaks, his voice is low, almost a whisper. Okay, stay calm. I'll come over, all right. Just sit tight and keep the radio on. I nod, even though he can't see me, and grip the radio tighter. I try to keep my eyes on the lights, but they keep darting in and out of view, like they're playing some sort of game. The scream still echoes in my head, and I feel a tightness in my chest that won't go away. I don't know why, but I suddenly have this terrible feeling that Ben won't make it in time. I wait, staring out into the darkness, my mind racing. Ben said he's coming, but I don't know how long it will take him to get here. I keep watching the trees below, hoping those strange lights will disappear. Then I hear a slow, creaking sound from below. The wooden steps of the tower. My heart pounds in my chest. Something is climbing up. I freeze, hardly daring to breathe, listening as the creaking continues, each step getting louder, closer. I reach for the radio, but my hand is shaking so badly, I almost drop it. Ben, I whisper, my voice barely audible. Something's here. I don't know what it is, but it's climbing up the tower. I don't even know if he hears me. I can barely hear myself. But the creaking keeps coming, step by step, until I'm sure it's right outside the door. I don't want to look, but I force myself to glance at the small window by the door. And that's when I see it, a face, or maybe the lack of one. It's pale, empty, like a blank sheet of paper, with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin where a face should be. And it's staring right at me. I feel a scream building in my throat, but I can't make a sound. My whole body is frozen, my mind racing. The door rattles as the thing pushes against it, harder and harder, until the wood starts to splinter. Suddenly, I hear a crash from the other side of the room. I turn just in time to see the door burst open, and the creature lunges inside. Ben tries to hold it back, but it's too strong. It knocks him down with a force that seems impossible. I want to help him, but my feet feel like they're glued to the floor. I can only watch in horror as it moves over him, and in a single swift motion, it's all over. Ben is still. The creature slowly turns its blank face back to me, and that's when I snap out of it. I have to get out of here. I can barely think. My legs feel weak, but somehow I force myself to move. I dash to the other side of the room, grabbing hold of the railing and flinging myself onto the stairs outside. The air is cold, and I'm shaking so hard it feels like I might lose my grip, but I can't stop. I have to get away. I hear something behind me, the creature's footsteps, slow but steady, coming closer. I don't look back. I just keep moving, my feet slipping on the steps as I try to get down as quickly as I can. The forest stretches out below me, dark and endless, and all I can think is that I need to reach it. Maybe if I get into the trees, I can hide. Maybe it won't find me there. My foot slips on a step, and for a second, I feel myself falling. I grab the railing, heart racing, and catch myself just in time. But I know I'm losing precious seconds. The creature's footsteps are louder now, almost right behind me. I reach the last set of steps, taking them 2 at a time. I'm so close, just a few more steps and I'll be on the ground. But as I jump down, my foot twists under me, and I feel a sharp pain shoot up my leg. I tumble forward, hitting the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment, everything goes blurry and I can't move. All I can hear is my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the faint rustling of leaves around me. I try to get up, but my leg throbs with pain, and I know I can't run anymore. I lie there, helpless, as the creature slowly comes down the stairs, its footsteps calm, like it knows it has all the time in the world. I lie on the ground, every muscle frozen, watching the creature make its way down the last few steps. Its blank face is turned toward me, and even though it has no eyes, I feel its gaze piercing right through me. I try to crawl away, but my leg won't support me. I can only inch backward, dragging myself through the dirt as the creature comes closer. My mind races with thoughts of Ben, the radio, the strange lights in the forest. I wonder if anyone else will hear the screams, if anyone else will know what happened here. I wonder if anyone else has seen what I'm seeing now. The creature stops just a few feet away, tilting its head like it's studying me. Then, slowly, it reaches out, its fingers stretching toward me. I want to scream, to get away, but there's nowhere to go. I feel its cold, empty hand close around my arm and everything goes dark. The next thing I know, I'm somewhere else. I'm not sure if I'm dreaming or awake. I can hear voices, faint and muffled, calling my name. My body feels heavy, too heavy to move, but my mind drifts in and out, catching bits and pieces of the world around me. When I finally wake up, I'm not in the forest anymore. I'm somewhere cold with people standing around me. A search team, I think. They're talking in hushed voices, looking down at something on the ground. I follow their gaze and realize they're looking at me or what's left of me. Then I see them 5 bodies lying near me, faces twisted with fear, dressed in the same uniforms as mine. The missing watchers, the ones who never came back. And now, I understand. I'm the 6th. As the search team takes photos, one of them looks up at the tower, where I see a flicker of light again, just as it had started that night. The forest holds its breath, and I know that the tower isn't done with its secrets yet. I still remember that morning, clear as day. I was standing on the dock, looking at the calm, gray ocean while the tourists clambered into my boat, all cheerful and excited. They'd come out to this sleepy fishing village for one reason: to catch something big. I was their guide, Tom, the local fisherman who knew these waters like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The 4 of them were all smiles, snapping pictures, chattering away about what they might catch. It felt like just another day on the job for me, taking people out, letting them fish, and then bringing them back with stories to tell. But there was something different that morning, a strange stillness in the air. The kind that made you feel like you should whisper, even though there was no one else around. I ignored it, though. Bad feeling or not, I had a job to do. We cast off and headed out, leaving the shoreline behind as we moved farther into open water. It was peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that lets you feel alone in the world, even when you're with other people. Then, about an hour in, the fog started rolling in. At first, it was just a light haze. but it quickly thickened, like some giant, silent wave. Within minutes, the fog had swallowed everything: the horizon, the sun, even our own boat looked ghostly in that thick, gray mist. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. The tourists went quiet too. The fog was so thick now, it felt like it was wrapping around us, pressing in from every side. I kept looking back at the tourists, giving them a reassuring smile I didn't really feel. They were huddled close together, peering into the mist, maybe wondering if we'd get lost out here. Then we heard it, the first splash. Just a small, distant sound, like someone had tossed a rock into the water. At first, I thought it was nothing. The ocean makes noises all the time, right? But then it happened again, this time closer. And then again, louder. Whatever was making that sound was getting nearer. The tourists whispered to each other, their voices low and worried. I tried to shake off the feeling that was creeping over me. It was probably just some fish, I told myself. Big fish sometimes move in schools, making a lot of noise. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I tried starting the motor, thinking it'd be best to move us out of there. But as soon as I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, and it just clicked uselessly. My stomach tightened. I knew this boat inside and out. I'd never had a problem with it before. Now we were stuck, dead in the water, wrapped in this thick fog with nothing but strange splashes echoing around us. One of the tourists called out, asking if everything was all right. I nodded and lied, saying, "Yeah, just a little engine trouble. I'll get it sorted." But I could feel it, something wasn't right. And the others must have sensed it too. They were looking at me with wide, nervous eyes, waiting for me to tell them everything would be okay. But I had no idea if that was true. Just as I was trying to think of what to do next, something huge slammed into the boat from below. The whole thing jerked so hard I nearly lost my balance, and two of the tourists did. They stumbled backward, right to the edge of the boat, and before any of us could react, they tumbled over into the water. There was this horrible, panicked silence for a second. Then they started shouting, thrashing around, trying to grab onto anything. I rushed to the edge to pull them back in, heart pounding. But with the fog so thick, I couldn't even see them clearly. I could only hear their splashes and desperate calls for help. Then, suddenly, the splashing stopped, just like that. The silence hit harder than any noise could have. I kept calling their names, hoping they'd answer, that they'd pop up any second. But there was nothing. Just the cold, eerie stillness of the fog and the empty stretch of water. The other two tourists were clinging to each other, eyes wide with terror, whispering things like, "What's happening, and where did they go?" I didn't have an answer. My hands were shaking. All I knew was that something powerful, something huge was out there, just under the surface, and we were sitting ducks. Then, before I could say anything, I saw something move in the fog right off the side of the boat. It was long, dark, and twisting, like some kind of arm or tentacle reaching out of the water. I froze, staring at the water, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The fog made it hard to focus, but there was no mistaking it. The thing was massive, at least as big as the boat, if not bigger. The tentacle or whatever it was rose up slowly, like it was testing the air. It was thick and dark, covered in what looked like scales or barnacles. I couldn't even process how big it was. It was like something out of a nightmare, except it was real. The others must have seen it too, because they started screaming. One of the tourists, the guy in the red shirt, was staring at the water, his mouth open like he wanted to shout, but nothing came out. And then, with a sudden, horrifying speed, the tentacle shot forward. It wrapped around his legs, pulling him under before any of us could even react. His scream was cut off almost instantly, swallowed by the water. I don't know what happened to him after that. The fog swallowed him up. There was nothing left but the ripples in the water. The last tourist, a woman with blonde hair, was shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back, trying to get her away from the edge of the boat. But she was beyond reasoning. She was terrified. And when the tentacle came back, reaching for the boat again, she didn't even think. She just screamed, "No," and jumped into the water, as if the sea was safer than staying on the boat. "Don't," I yelled, but it was too late. She hit the water with a splash and disappeared almost instantly, the fog swallowing her whole. I stood there, numb, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone with the thing. I knew I should move, should try to start the engine again or get us out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in horror as another tentacle shot up, grabbing the woman and pulling her down. The last thing I saw before I turned my head away, in a kind of shock, was the thing's massive jaws. They opened wide, far too big for anything natural, and swallowed her whole. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The horror of it all hit me in waves. What was out there? What was I going to do? And that's when I felt that something was coming for me next. My mind was racing, and my heart felt like it might explode. I knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was out there to come for me next. I forced myself to move, crawling to the back of the boat, where I kept an emergency paddle. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto it, but I knew it was my only chance. I leaned over the side and started paddling as fast as I could, my eyes locked on the thick fog around me. I couldn't see anything beyond the boat. Every sound, every little splash made me flinch. I could still hear their screams in my head, the tourists' faces flashing before me. The terror was crushing. Suddenly there was another thud from below. I felt the boat lurch, but I just kept paddling, praying it wouldn't strike again. My arms were burning, and I knew I couldn't go much further. But just when I thought I'd collapse from exhaustion, I saw the faint outline of the shore through the fog. I didn't even think. I just jumped out of the boat and started swimming, using every ounce of strength I had. The cold water bit into me, but I kept going, desperate to get away from whatever was lurking behind me. When I finally stumbled onto the shore, I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my body weak and shaking. I looked back toward the water, half expecting to see that thing rising up from the waves, but the fog was already starting to lift, leaving the sea calm and empty, as if none of it had happened. But I knew the truth. I'd seen it all, and I'd never forget it. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and everything started going dark around me. I lay back on the cold sand. My last thought was of those poor tourists and the monster that had taken them. And then, everything went silent. They found me there on the shore the next morning. The fishermen from my village said I looked pale and cold, my body covered in cuts and bruises from the rocks. They said I had this look on my face, like I'd seen something no one should ever see. The villagers took me back, but they couldn't get a word out of me. They didn't understand what had happened, and honestly, I don't know if I could have explained it, even if I wanted to. They asked about the tourists, the boat, where we had gone. I could only stare back, unable to speak, unable to even look toward the ocean. Days later, they found pieces of the boat washed up along the shore. Bits of wood, fishing gear, a camera that had belonged to one of the tourists, all broken and scattered. People started whispering about what I might have seen out there, what could have torn apart a boat like that. But I kept my silence. They say some stories are too heavy to tell, too dark to be spoken out loud, and this was one of them. After a while, folks just stopped asking. The fog returned every now and then, thick and ghostly, but nobody from the village dared to go fishing when it was that heavy. To this day, they still talk about that morning. Some call it just a strange accident, others say the sea has secrets best left alone. But me, I'll never go back out there. Not after what I saw. Not ever. I'm Ranger Pete, and on that day it felt like any other school field trip. The sun was out, birds were chirping, and the air had that fresh, earthy smell that makes the forest feel alive. I'd been doing these school tours for years, and the kids were always full of energy, asking questions about trees, rocks, and animals. This time we had Mrs. Thompson's class from Cedarwood Elementary. They were a little rowdy, but I could tell they were excited to be there. We were halfway through the hike, following a safe, well-marked trail. I remember looking over my shoulder at the group, the kids huddling in groups of 2s and 3s, their small backpacks bouncing with each step. They were laughing, pointing at butterflies and squirrels. Just an ordinary, happy day. Then, as we rounded a bend, I noticed a small path I'd never seen before. It was narrow, almost hidden behind a thick cluster of bushes. The path seemed to lead deeper into the woods, off the main trail. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it. One of the kids noticed too. "Where does that go, Mr. Pete?" he asked, wide-eyed. I paused, looking at the dark path stretching out before us. Something about it felt different, but not dangerous, just different. "I'm not sure, buddy," I replied with a small smile. "It's not on any of the maps, but maybe it's just a shortcut." The kids were curious and begged to explore, and Mrs. Thompson gave me a little nod, a hint of excitement on her face too. So against my usual judgment, I agreed. We stepped off the main trail and onto the old path, unaware of the nightmare waiting for us just a few steps away. As we started down the hidden path, the forest seemed to change around us. The sun that had been shining so brightly just minutes before was now barely breaking through the trees. Shadows stretched longer, and the light seemed dim with every step we took. The air, once warm and fresh, now felt cold, like it was slipping right through my jacket. A few of the kids shivered and zipped up their coats, glancing around. "Mr. Pete, why is it getting so cold?" one of the kids asked, hugging himself tight. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sometimes the trees make it cooler in parts of the forest," I said, though even I didn't believe it. This was different. I could feel it, like a chill creeping right into my bones, but I didn't want to scare them. We kept walking, and it was so quiet. Not a single bird chirping, no rustling in the bushes, no sound of squirrels scurrying around. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. Mrs. Thompson shot me a look, and I could tell she felt it too. I tried to shake it off and focused on leading us forward. Then we reached a huge, jagged rock jutting out of the ground, like it had been dropped there by mistake. It was covered in moss, dark and thick, and seemed almost too big to be natural. The kids crowded around it, curious and whispering, but something in me told me to keep moving. Just as I opened my mouth to call them forward, I noticed two kids ducking behind the rock, laughing. "Hey, guys," I called, "come back here. Don't go too far." But when I walked over, they were gone. Just like that. No laughing, no footsteps, nothing. I looked back at the rest of the group, a nervous feeling building in my stomach. Mrs. Thompson noticed too. "I'll get them," she said quickly, hurrying over to the rock and stepping behind it. But a few moments passed and she didn't come back either. I felt my pulse quicken. This was wrong, something was wrong. I turned to the other kids, their faces pale and worried now. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "All right, everyone," I said as calmly as I could. "Let's stay together and wait right here." But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me we might have already gone too far. We waited by the rock, my heart thumping in my chest as I glanced around. A minute passed, then another. Mrs. Thompson and the two kids didn't come back. I kept telling myself they were just playing a trick, hiding, or maybe had wandered off a little farther than I'd thought. But deep down, something didn't feel right. "Mr. Pete, where did they go?" a girl whispered, her voice shaky. I forced a smile. "They'll be back soon. Just stay close, all right." I peered around the rock, expecting to see them hiding or waiting with a grin. But all I saw were trees stretching into darkness, deeper than I remembered them being a moment ago. I walked a few steps, calling their names, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. No answer. No answer. I hurried back to the group, trying to keep myself calm, even though my hands were shaking. I needed to stay strong for the kids. "All right, everyone, let's form a circle here, okay? We're going to wait right here until Mrs. Thompson and the others come back." The kids shuffled together, clutching their backpacks and huddling close. The air seemed to get even colder, and a low fog started to creep along the ground, swirling around our feet. I could see the worry on their faces. I felt it too, like a weight pressing down on me. "Mr. Pete," a boy whispered, looking into the trees, "Are we lost?" "No, we're not lost," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We just have to stay calm and wait. Everything's going to be fine." But as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The silence felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I had the urge to run, but I couldn't. I had to protect the kids. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a flicker in the shadows between the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just dark shapes stretching out around us, almost as if they were watching, waiting. The shadows around us seemed to shift and grow, taking on strange shapes, almost like figures but twisted and wrong. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The forest, usually so calm and quiet, felt like it was closing in on us. My mind kept going back to Mrs. Thompson and the two kids who vanished. Where could they have gone? And why was everything around us still? Then I saw a shape slipping out from behind a tree, moving fast but with an odd, jerking motion, like it was crawling or skittering. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then more shadows appeared, moving from tree to tree, just beyond the circle of kids. My heart pounded. They were tall, too tall to be animals, and they moved like spiders with long, spindly limbs that stretched as they crept closer. The kids noticed too. One girl screamed, clutching her friend's hand as she pointed toward the trees. More shadows emerged, inching forward, their movements unnatural and silent. They didn't make a sound, but the fear in the air was loud enough. "Stay close, everyone," I said, though my voice trembled. I tried to keep the kids huddled together, but panic was starting to set in. A few of them clutched at my arms, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I wanted to tell them it would be okay, that we'd be fine, but I didn't have the words. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, but all I could see were those shadow creatures, closing in. Then, before I could react, one of the creatures lunged forward, its shadowy limbs wrapping around a boy at the edge of the group. He let out a scream, and I tried to reach for him, but it pulled him back so fast, he was gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness. Chaos erupted. Kids screamed, scrambling to get closer to me, but the shadows kept coming, picking them off one by one. I grabbed as many as I could, pulling them close, trying to shield them. Half of them were gone in seconds, pulled into the dark by those crawling shadows, their terrified screams echoing in the stillness. "Run," I yelled, pushing the last few kids toward the path we'd come from. I didn't look back, I couldn't. All I could do was run, with those remaining kids clinging to my hands, desperate to escape. We ran as fast as we could, my heart pounding as I held onto the 3 kids who were left. Their small hands clutched mine so tightly it hurt, but I didn't let go. We stumbled through the trees, back along the old trail, not daring to look back. I could still hear the sounds behind us, whispers, rustling, like those creatures were following, just out of sight, waiting for us to slow down. I pushed the kids forward, urging them on even as my legs started to feel heavy. The forest around us seemed darker than before, and I could barely make out the path. But we kept going, the cold air biting at our skin. My breaths were shallow, my mind focused on one thing: getting the kids out of there. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and back onto the main trail. The sunlight hit us, weak and fading, but it was a relief. I stopped, panting, as the kids collapsed on the ground, breathing hard, tears streaming down their faces. I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see those shadows crawling out after us. But there was nothing, just the silent, dark trees. The kids were safe, at least the ones I'd managed to save. But my stomach twisted with guilt as I thought of the others. Mrs. Thompson, the kids who vanished, they were gone, just like that. And no one would believe what we saw. I barely believed it myself. I knelt down beside the kids, pulling them close, telling them we were safe now, even though I wasn't sure I believed it. The forest felt different now, like it was hiding secrets I would never understand. I had no answers for what we'd seen, no way to explain the creatures or why they'd taken the others. All I knew was that we were lucky to have escaped. As we slowly made our way back to the park's entrance, the kids silent and clinging close, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. We left the trail that day, but I knew I'd never really leave it behind. And every time I think of that old hidden trail, I feel a chill run down my spine, wondering if it's still out there waiting for the next person to step off the main path. I've always loved my early morning walks through the forest. As a park ranger, I know these woods like the back of my hand. Every tree, every path, every sound feels familiar. It's like a second home, and my dog, Rex, is always right there with me, trotting along by my side. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm glow through the trees, and the birds were singing their morning songs. Everything felt peaceful, just as it should be. But then, something strange caught my eye. I spotted a set of tracks in the dirt, big ones. They didn't look like the usual animal prints I was used to. These looked like huge handprints with fingers that were long and thin, almost like someone had stretched them out. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edge of one of the prints. "What do you think, Rex?" I asked, half joking. But Rex didn't react like usual. Instead of sniffing around or wagging his tail, he took a step back, his ears pinned tight to his head. That's when I felt a chill go up my spine. Rex was usually brave, ready to chase after anything that moved. But now he was just staring into the trees, tense and uneasy. I tried to shrug it off. Probably just a bear or something, I muttered under my breath, but even I wasn't convinced. As we moved further along the path, I noticed something else strange. The birds had stopped singing. The cheerful songs that had filled the air were gone, leaving an eerie silence hanging around US.Rex, and I kept moving, but something didn't feel right. The silence around us was heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Every step we took felt louder than it should. My heart started beating a little faster, though I couldn't say exactly why. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild, but Rex wasn't acting like himself either. He was walking close to my side, glancing around like he was on high alert. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, like a soft whimper, drifting through the trees. It almost sounded like someone was crying. My first thought was that maybe someone was lost or hurt. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small in the thick silence. There was no answer, but the whimpering continued, slow and weak, like someone who needed help but couldn't call out. I looked down at Rex, and he was staring into the trees, his body tense. I could feel his fear. "Stay close, boy," I whispered, patting his head for comfort, mostly for myself. With a deep breath, I took a step off the path, following the sound through the thick trees. As we went deeper, the crying grew louder. It sounded human, but there was something wrong about it. The tone shifted now and then, almost like an animal trying to mimic a person's voice. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I also didn't want to leave if someone was really in trouble. We kept walking, moving slow. Rex's whine grew louder as he pressed closer to my leg, clearly wanting to go back. But I had to know. I followed the sound, my eyes scanning the trees around me. The crying got louder, but there was still no one in sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, like a weight pressing on my chest, the way the sound echoed between the trees. It didn't feel natural. It was almost as if the forest itself was playing tricks on me. "Hello," I called again, hoping for some kind of response. But the only answer was that strange, pitiful wailing. I glanced down at Rex, and he was frozen, his eyes locked on something ahead of us. His fur was standing straight up along his back, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I tried to follow his gaze, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see much. Then I saw a flash of white, something tall and thin slipping between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a figure, but it moved in an odd, jerky way, too quick and quiet for anything human. For a second, I thought maybe I was seeing things, that maybe a trick of the light had played with my mind. The figure stopped, standing still between two trees. It looked almost like a person, but something was off. The body was too tall, the limbs too long and thin, stretched out like shadows, and then it tilted its head, almost as if it was watching me. Rex's growl grew louder, and I could feel my own pulse pounding. I took a step back, pulling Rex with me. My gut told me to turn and run, to get as far away as possible, but that strange cry called out again, weaker this time, and it sounded like it was coming from that thing. The thing stood there, still as a statue, its head tilted like it was studying us. My throat went dry, and every instinct told me to get out of there, but something held me in place, like I was trapped in a bad dream. I kept hoping I was imagining things, that it was just a shadow, just a trick of the light. But as I watched, it took a slow, shaky step forward. Rex barked, snapping me out of my daze. That bark was the loudest sound in the whole forest, and suddenly the thing started moving faster, closing the distance between us in an eerie, silent way. I felt a surge of panic and yelled, "Go back." But it was like the thing didn't even hear me. It just kept coming, those long, white limbs reaching forward. In a split second, it lunged at us. Rex leaped between me and the creature, his teeth bared, growling fiercely. I'd never seen him like that before, all his fear replaced with a fierce protectiveness. He launched himself at the thing, biting and snapping, doing everything he could to keep it away from me. But the creature was strong. It twisted and writhed, its arms moving in unnatural ways as it fought Rex. I tried to pull Rex back, to somehow get us out of there, but he wouldn't leave my side. He kept fighting, growling and barking, even as the thing's sharp, claw-like fingers tore into him. I was frozen, torn between running and staying to help him, but I knew I couldn't win this fight. "Rex, come on," I shouted, my voice breaking, but he wouldn't listen. He was giving everything he had, trying to keep me safe. Then, with a sickening feeling in my chest, I realized Rex wasn't going to make it. He was giving me a chance to escape. I took one last look at him, my heart breaking, and then I turned and ran, tears streaming down my face. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in gasps, the trees around me a blur. My chest felt tight with fear and heartbreak. I couldn't hear Rex anymore, couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own footsteps and the distant echo of that horrible crying sound fading into the trees. I didn't stop running until I burst out onto the main path, the familiar dirt trail that led back to the ranger station. I stumbled and nearly fell, my legs shaking, but somehow I kept moving until I finally reached safety. Back at the station, everything was quiet and still. The other rangers were already out on their patrols, so the place was empty. I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind spinning with what I'd just seen. I knew I had to tell someone, but what would I even say? Who would believe that there was something not human out there in the woods? I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes it was morning. A few rangers were back by then and I heard them talking outside. I stepped out, still feeling numb, but then their words hit me like a punch to the gut. 3 rangers had been found dead, scattered along different parts of the forest. Their faces were twisted in fear, just like Rex's had been. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't just me that thing was still out there. It had killed them, and it would have gotten me too if it hadn't been for Rex. A wave of sadness hit me, and I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I lost my best friend out there, but he'd saved me. As I looked out into the dark, endless forest, I knew one thing for sure: I'd never walk those trails alone again. Days passed, but the memories of that morning clung to me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rex's brave face, heard his growl, felt the cold fear that had held me in place as he fought to protect me. The other rangers noticed something was wrong. They'd ask, "Jim, what happened out there?" Or, "Are you okay?" But I didn't know how to explain it. How could I tell them about the thing in the forest, about the way it moved, about the cries that sounded almost human? They wouldn't believe me. And if they did, what would we even do? How do you fight something that isn't supposed to exist? I still had to go back to the forest each day. It was my job. But now, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent chills through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing again, lurking in the shadows. The birds would sometimes go silent, and my heart would race, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. One morning, I found myself standing near the spot where it had all happened. The ground was still torn up from where Rex had fought, the earth scarred from the struggle. I knelt down and placed a hand on the ground, my chest tight with grief. "Thank you, Rex," I whispered, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. He'd saved my life, even when it meant losing his own. Since then, I've warned every new ranger, every hiker I meet, to be careful, to stay on the paths, and to leave the forest well before dark. I'll never forget what I saw, and I'll make sure no one else falls victim to it. And every once in a while, when I'm alone in the forest and the birds go silent, I swear I can still hear that faint, haunting cry echoing through the trees, a reminder of the creature that hides in the darkness, waiting. It was supposed to be just another night shift. I had been doing this job for a while now, patrolling the woods with a group of junior rangers, mostly college kids looking for some adventure. Tonight, it was me, Tom, Alex, and Megan. They were good kids, eager, and always a little jumpy whenever we worked the night shift. As we moved deeper into the woods, something felt off. The trees here didn't look right. They were twisted and bent, their branches like clawed fingers reaching up to the sky. I'd never seen them like this before. It was as if they were watching us, each one leaning in closer as we walked past. I tried to ignore the feeling, brushing it off as just another strange night in the forest. The trail got darker, even though the moon was full and shining bright. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path, and every now and then, we'd hear strange noises like whispers, but not from any animal I knew. Tom joked that the trees had come alive, and Alex chuckled nervously, but I could see their eyes darting around. I didn't feel like laughing. Then, I looked down at my watch. Midnight. But that wasn't right. It couldn't be midnight. We had just started our patrol, and I was sure we had left around 10. I tapped the watch face, but the hand stayed frozen, pointed at 12. Anyone else's watch acting up, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They all checked their wrists. Tom, Alex, Megan, all their watches had stopped, right at midnight. That's when I knew we weren't alone. We stood there, just staring at our frozen watches, none of us saying a word. There was this heaviness in the air, like something was pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I didn't see anything, just trees, shadows, and fog. Then, out of nowhere, a small figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing there in a simple white dress. She had long, dark hair that covered most of her face. Just seeing her there alone in the middle of the woods made my stomach twist. Kids don't just wander around here, especially not at night. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, keeping my voice gentle, but inside I was tense, ready for anything. She didn't answer, didn't even move. She just stared at us, and that's when I noticed her smile. It was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that wasn't right. "Where are your parents?" Megan asked, taking a small step forward. Still, the girl didn't answer. She kept smiling, showing teeth that looked sharp, way sharper than they should have been. I tried to convince myself that it was just the moonlight playing tricks on us, but something about her was all wrong. It was like she didn't belong here, like she was part of the forest, part of whatever strange things were happening tonight. "Maybe we should head back," Alex whispered, barely loud enough to hear. I nodded, trying to keep calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that turning our backs on her would be a mistake. That's when Tom stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the girl. Tom took a step closer to the girl, his eyes locked on her strange, too wide smile. I wanted to pull him back, to tell him to stop, but something kept me quiet. It was like the air had thickened around us, holding us in place. "Are you lost?" Tom asked her, his voice barely a whisper. The girl didn't answer. She just tilted her head to the side, like she was studying him, her smile never fading. Then, slowly, she lifted her arm and pointed into the thick fog beyond the trail, off to the left. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just darkness and shadows. Tom, though, seemed drawn to it, like he was under some kind of spell. Without saying another word, he started walking toward the fog, his steps slow and almost unnatural, like he wasn't fully in control. "Tom, stop," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. But he didn't turn around. He kept walking, disappearing into the mist, his figure fading away until there was nothing left but silence. The rest of us just stood there, frozen. My heart was pounding, but I felt paralyzed, like something was holding me in place. I wanted to run after him, but the fog was so thick now that I couldn't even see a few feet ahead. "Tom," Megan called out, her voice shaky. "This isn't funny. Where are you?" There was no answer, just that thick, suffocating silence. The girl hadn't moved. She was still standing there, still smiling that horrible, sharp-toothed smile. And for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, something dark and hungry. It was like she was waiting for one of us to go after him. We stood there, hearts racing, waiting for any sign of Tom. The fog just seemed to swallow him up. It was like he had vanished into another world. The girl was still watching us, that creepy smile stretched across her face, and I could feel her eyes on me, studying us like she was trying to decide what to do next. "We have to find him," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. But Alex and Megan nodded. None of us wanted to leave Tom out there alone, especially not with whatever was going on. We turned and stepped off the trail, heading into the fog, calling out Tom's name. The trees felt even closer here, their branches twisting around each other, making the path harder to see. Every now and then we'd hear a soft rustling sound, like something was moving just out of sight. Then, suddenly, Megan stopped dead in her tracks. "Look," she whispered, pointing at the ground ahead of us. There, in the dirt, was a deep, dark hole. It was about as wide as a manhole, but looked like it went down forever, just an endless, black pit. I couldn't see the bottom. There was something about it that made my stomach churn, like it was, waiting for us. Alex took a step closer, peering down into the hole. "Tom, are you down there?" As soon as he leaned over, a pair of pale, bony hands shot up from the darkness, grabbing his ankles. Alex let out a scream, but before we could even react, he was yanked down, disappearing into the darkness. His scream faded fast, swallowed by the hole. Megan and I stumbled back, breathless, staring at the hole, terrified. And that's when we realized the girl was gone. Megan grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. We both stood there, staring at the empty spot where the girl had been. She was gone, but I could still feel her presence, like she was somewhere close, watching us, waiting. "We need to go." Now Megan whispered, her voice barely holding together. I nodded, not even looking back as we turned and started running through the trees. Every step felt heavy, like the forest itself was trying to hold us back. Branches seemed to reach out, snagging our clothes, scratching our skin. The fog had thickened, swirling around us, making it almost impossible to see where we were going. Behind us, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, steady, getting closer. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept running, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. Suddenly, Megan stumbled. She let out a small gasp and hit the ground hard, her flashlight slipping from her hand. I skidded to a stop, reaching down to help her up. But before I could grab her, something else did. A shadow moved in the fog, dark and hulking, and I watched in horror as it grabbed Megan, dragging her backward. Her fingers clawed at the ground, and she looked up at me, her face twisted with fear. "Dave, help me." I reached out, but it was too late. She was pulled into the mist, her scream echoing for only a moment before it vanished, swallowed by the silence. I was alone now. My breath was shaky, and I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me. And in that heavy silence I heard something. Breathing. Slow, deep breaths. Close, too close. I could barely breathe. My hands shook as I gripped my flashlight, the weak beam trembling as I turned in slow circles, trying to see where the sound was coming from. The breathing grew louder, deeper, echoing through the trees, and I knew I was not alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The little girl was back, but she wasn't small anymore. She stood tall, towering over me, her body twisted and stretched, her limbs too long, her fingers ending in sharp, bony points. Her face still wore that smile, but it was wider now, her mouth filled with sharp, needle-like teeth that glistened in the moonlight. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I forced myself to move, to turn and run. I could hear her footsteps, heavy and steady, pounding behind me. No matter how fast I ran, the sound got closer, her breathing right behind me, warm and thick. Then I tripped. My flashlight flew from my hand, rolling away into the darkness. I tried to get up, but I could feel her shadow looming over me, her cold breath on my neck. Before I could scream, everything went black. The forest went quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. No more footsteps, no more breathing, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in the dark, too scared to even open my eyes. When I finally did, the woods looked normal. The fog had lifted, and the trees, though still twisted and strange, felt less alive, less threatening. But Tom, Alex, Megan, they were all gone. The girl was gone, too, as if she'd never been there. I looked around, hoping to see some trace of them, some sign that they were okay, but there was nothing. Just me, lying in the dirt, alone. I managed to stand, every muscle in my body aching. My flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam flickering weakly. I picked it up and stumbled back toward the trail, my steps shaky, my heart still racing. As I reached the edge of the woods, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just shadows and trees. Yet, even now, I can still feel her eyes on me. I don't think she'll ever really let me go. I made it out of the woods that night, but nothing has felt right since. Back at the station, I tried to explain what happened to the others, but the words wouldn't come out. How could I explain that they were just gone? People searched the forest for days, but they didn't find a trace of Tom, Alex, or Megan. No footprints, no belongings, nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. They say it was just an accident. They say maybe they got lost, maybe something happened out there that night. But I know the truth, even if no one believes me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see her standing in the fog, her smile wide and sharp. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear things I shouldn't. Soft footsteps down the hall. a faint whisper outside my window. The sound of breathing, deep and slow, like it's right behind me. I keep telling myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I know she's still out there, waiting, watching. And every time the clock hits midnight, I can feel her closer, as if one day she'll come back, to finish what she started. My name is Kim, and I never thought a regular night shift would turn into something out of a nightmare. It was a stormy night, rain pouring, thunder booming, lightning flashing outside. The whole building seemed to shake every time lightning struck. I was working late with my coworker Dan, who kept making bad jokes to lighten the creepy vibe that only grew as the storm got worse. Around midnight, just as we were wrapping up, the power went out. Everything went dark in an instant, and only flashes of lightning from outside gave us glimpses of the office. Dan and I laughed at first, assuming the power would be back soon. But then, in one of those lightning flashes, I saw something strange, a shadow, but it didn't look like either of us. Just lurking there, in the corner of the room. I looked over at Dan, and I could tell he'd seen it too. We tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. Dan decided to check the circuit box in the basement, thinking maybe he could fix the power. I didn't love the idea of him going down there alone, especially with how weird the night felt, but he was sure to be a quick fix. So, with his phone flashlight guiding him, he headed down the hall and disappeared into the basement stairs. I stayed by the front desk, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping over me. I could still see flashes of lightning through the windows, and each one lit up the room for just a second. That's when I saw it again, a shadow. It moved across the room, quick but clear enough that I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I called out for Dan, hoping he'd just come back up and we could leave together. But instead, I heard him scream from down in the basement, a blood-curdling, terrified scream that echoed up the empty stairwell and filled the entire floor. The scream stopped suddenly, cutting off in a way that made my heart drop. My hands were shaking, but I knew I had to find him. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my own phone, turned on the flashlight, and started towards the basement, hoping that maybe he'd just tripped or gotten scared. But deep down, I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. As I took slow steps down the basement stairs, the air felt colder, like something was waiting down there. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could just make out the faint outline of boxes, pipes, and shelves along the walls. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake that awful feeling deep inside me. Dan, I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. There was no answer, just silence pressing in all around me. Then, in the corner of the room, my flashlight caught something, a shape lying on the floor. I froze, barely breathing, before stepping closer. It was Dan. His body was crumpled on the cold concrete floor, his face twisted in a way that I'd never seen before. His eyes, they were gone, just empty, dark spaces where they should have been. I stumbled back, covering my mouth to stop myself from screaming. I could feel tears in my eyes, but I didn't dare take my eyes off him. The room felt like it was closing in, like something was watching me from the shadows. And that's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound, coming from above me. The taps grew louder, moving from one window to the next, circling the building. Something, or someone, was out there, and they were getting closer. I backed up the stairs as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I had to get out of the basement. I had to get away from Dan's body and from whatever had done that to him. As I reached the main floor, the tapping continued, moving around the building in a slow, steady rhythm. It sounded almost like fingers drumming against the glass, as if something was testing each window, one by one. I forced myself to peek outside through the small gap in the blinds. The flash of lightning lit up the parking lot, and that's when I saw them, dark figures, standing in the rain, just outside the windows. Their shapes were blurry, almost melting into the shadows. But there was no mistaking the way they were lined up, all facing the building. Each time lightning struck, they seemed a little closer, edging their way toward me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had no way out. If I went outside, they'd be there waiting, and if I stayed in the building, I wasn't sure how long the doors and windows would keep them out. Then I remembered the security cameras. Maybe they'd show me where these things were or give me an idea of how to escape. I rushed to the security room, my hands shaking as I switched on the monitors. The screen showed every hallway, every corner of the building, but all I could see were shadows slipping past each camera, moving closer. There was nowhere left to hide. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a maze with no way out. The shadows on the security cameras were moving closer, slipping down the hallways, approaching room by room. I had to hide, and fast. I hurried down the hallway and ducked into the storage room, closing the door softly behind me. My breath came out in quick, shaky gasps as I locked the door and backed up against the shelves, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my phone tight, the flashlight off, hoping that in the darkness, maybe they wouldn't see me. The room was silent except for my own breathing, which sounded way too loud in the quiet. I leaned against a stack of boxes and tried to listen, every muscle tense, waiting for any hint of movement. Then, just outside the storage room, I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps that seemed to echo in the empty hallway. They stopped right outside the door, and then, tap, tap, tap. That same tapping sound right against the door this time, soft and steady, like a warning. I bit my lip, praying they wouldn't come inside. But as the seconds dragged on, I could feel something strange in the air, like a chill seeping through the door. And then, as midnight struck, the door handle started to turn. I held my breath, watching the door handle turn slowly, inch by inch, as if someone or something was testing it, deciding whether to come inside. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. I pressed myself back against the shelves, praying the shadows wouldn't find me here. The handle stopped turning, and for a moment, everything was silent. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd moved on. But then, in the dim light from the tiny crack under the door, I saw a shadow, darker than the rest, slipping inside, sliding across the floor like it had no weight, no shape. It crept closer, a heavy, unnatural darkness that felt like it was swallowing the air in the room. I could barely breathe as it moved toward me, inching closer, reaching out like it was searching, sensing my presence. I held my phone tight, my thumb shaking over the flashlight button, knowing it was my only chance. I squeezed my eyes shut, then clicked the flashlight on, aiming it straight at the shadow. For a second, I thought I saw something, a face, or the hint of eyes staring back at me. But the light just passed through it, like it wasn't even there. And then, the light flickered and went out, leaving me in the darkness once more. The room was pitch black again, and I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing in, so close I could almost feel their cold touch on my skin. My phone was dead, my only source of light gone, and all I had now was the dark. I held still, not daring to make a sound, barely even breathing. But then, the tapping started again. This time it was all around me, not just outside the door. It was on the walls, the floor, even the shelves behind me. Tap, 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 like 100 fingers drumming from every direction. The noise grew louder, faster, until it felt like my head would explode. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere left to go. I felt completely trapped, the shadows closing in until they were right in front of me. I could feel their icy presence, hear their whispers, though I couldn't understand a word. Then, all at once, everything went silent. The tapping stopped, the shadows seemed to pull back, and for one terrifying moment, I was left alone in the dark, holding my breath, waiting. And then, just as the clock struck 12, I felt a cold hand reach out and touch my shoulder. The icy touch on my shoulder sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I felt trapped, like a fly caught in a web, and whatever was in the room with me, it was finally here. I dared to open my eyes just a bit, hoping I wouldn't see anything. But there, in the darkness, were faint shapes, faces twisted in unnatural ways, staring right at me. Shadows pressed in from all sides, their eyes empty, dark, and hungry. I whispered, "Please, just let me go." My voice cracked, barely more than a breath. For a second, it seemed like the shadows paused, almost as if they heard me. But then they moved closer, surrounding me until I couldn't see anything else, their whispers filling my ears, drowning out every other sound. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew one thing for sure: they wanted me to stay. And then, as my last bit of strength faded, I felt myself slipping, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw was the faint glow of lightning through the window, casting my own shadow on the wall. But it wasn't alone. As the shadows closed in, I felt my mind drifting, slipping into a strange emptiness, like falling into a deep, endless sleep. My heartbeat slowed, blending with the whispering voices all around me. I felt less like myself and more like them. I could barely feel my own body, just a cold, heavy numbness, as if I was sinking into the floor, becoming part of the dark. The shadows kept whispering, and somehow I started to understand their words. They were calling me, welcoming me into the darkness, as if I belonged there. In one last flash of lightning, I saw my reflection in the window. My face was pale, eyes hollow, almost like Dan's. I reached out, and the cold glass felt strange against my fingers, like I was touching it from the other side. Then the storm outside quieted, the lightning faded, and all that was left was silence. In the darkness, I could feel. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of the scariest weekend of my life. It all started with what seemed like a great idea, a weekend trip with my friend Jack to a cabin deep in the forest. Jack and I loved taking wildlife photos. He had an amazing camera, and we'd often spend hours in the woods looking for deer, owls, or any wild animals that came by. This cabin was perfect, a bit run down, but quiet, secluded, and far from any other people. It's exactly what we wanted. The cabin was old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled every time the wind blew. When we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We laughed, talking about how creepy it looked, but we were more excited than scared. After unpacking, we set up some traps and trail cameras around the cabin, hoping to capture photos of animals at night. Jack told me stories about big creatures he'd read about, things with glowing eyes, creatures that roamed the woods at night. We laughed it off, saying they were just stories, nothing real. But as it turned out, this wasn't like any other camping trip. That first night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing noises outside. Rustling in the bushes, twigs snapping. It sounded close, maybe even right outside the cabin. I told myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a deer. But when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of shadows, tall and dark, moving slowly through the trees. The next morning, Jack and I checked the cameras we'd set up. Most of the photos were empty, or showed small animals, rabbits, maybe a fox. But one picture caught my attention. It was blurry, like something had moved fast in front of the lens, but I could see a shadow in the shape of a tall figure. I told Jack it was probably just a trick of the light or an animal that got too close. Jack shrugged it off, but he looked a little uneasy. That night, things got weirder. As we sat around the cabin, we heard footsteps outside. They were slow, like someone taking their time, circling the cabin. Jack grabbed his camera, thinking it might be a big animal we could photograph. He opened the door and aimed his camera into the darkness, snapping a few pictures. We listened, barely breathing, but the footsteps stopped. We went back inside, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake this tense feeling. When we went to bed, I lay awake, listening to every little sound outside. My heart pounded with each creak of the cabin, each rustle of the leaves. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard the footsteps again, right outside my window this time. I didn't dare move. I kept my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But as I lay there, I had this horrible feeling, like something was standing just outside, watching me through the window. The next morning, neither Jack nor I said much about the footsteps. I think we both wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, like it was just our minds playing tricks. But there was this heaviness between us, like we both felt that something was wrong. Jack decided to check the traps we'd set up deeper in the woods. He took his camera, saying he'd be back in an hour. I offered to go with him, but he said he'd be fine and told me to stay and go through the pictures we'd taken. An hour passed, then another. I tried not to worry, telling myself Jack had just gotten distracted, maybe taking pictures of something cool. But as the sky started to darken, I couldn't ignore this sinking feeling in my stomach. I decided to go look for him. As I walked through the trees, calling his name, everything felt wrong. The air was still, almost too quiet, like even the birds had gone silent. I finally reached the spot where he'd set up the traps. One of the traps was tipped over, and there were deep scratches on the ground, like something had been dragged. Then I saw Jack's camera lying on the ground. The lens was shattered, and the body of the camera was cracked. I picked it up, hoping to find a clue, but all I could think was that something terrible had happened. I stood there, gripping Jack's broken camera, feeling a chill run down my spine. I called his name again, louder this time, but only silence answered me. I looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but all I saw were trees stretching out in every direction, shadows creeping over the forest floor as the sun dipped lower. And then, as I turned, I saw them, two red eyes staring back at me from between the trees. They were high up, almost at the height of a tall man, but they didn't look human. They glowed faintly, like burning coals, watching me without blinking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The eyes didn't move, just stayed there, fixed on me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. Finally, I took a step back, clutching the broken camera to my chest. The eyes seemed to follow my movement, shifting slightly as I backed away. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they vanished into the darkness. I turned and ran back to the cabin, not stopping until I slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. Outside, I thought I heard a faint rustling, like something moving through the trees. Whatever it was still out there. And Jack. He was still missing. As night fell, I locked every door and window in the cabin. I told myself that I was safe inside, that whatever was out there couldn't get in. But deep down, I wasn't sure. Every small sound outside made me jump, the wind rustling leaves, branches creaking. It all seemed too close, too real. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. I spun around and saw the front door, which I had just locked, swinging open. My heart raced as I walked over and pushed it shut, locking it again with shaky hands. But as soon as I turned my back, it burst open again, slamming against the wall so hard I thought the wood might crack. I stared at the door, frozen in place. Then came another noise, this time from the back of the cabin. I heard scratching, slow and steady, like something was scraping against the outside wall. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Jack," I whispered, though I knew he wouldn't answer. The scratching stopped, but the silence was even worse. It felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting. Then, all at once, every door in the cabin seemed to slam open and shut, one after another, like they were caught in some terrible windstorm. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, wishing it would all stop. And just as quickly as it started, everything went silent. I opened my eyes and looked around, but there was no one there. The doors hung open, creaking softly, as if taunting me. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the cabin. Something was here with me, and it was only getting closer. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. Every nerve in my body screamed to get out, to run as far as I could. Grabbing a flashlight and Jack's broken camera, I stepped outside, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest was dark and still, with only a thin sliver of moonlight to guide me. I moved slowly, barely breathing, listening for any sign of movement. But it was just silence, heavy, almost unnatural. As I crept forward, I felt eyes on me again. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, and there they were, those same red eyes, closer this time, shining from the darkness. The eyes were moving toward me, slipping in and out of the shadows. I took a step back, and then another, but it was fast. Too fast. It glided through the trees, closing the distance between us with an eerie, smooth movement, like it wasn't even touching the ground. Panicking, I turned and ran, my footsteps crunching through the leaves, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. I could feel it behind me, could hear the soft rustle as it moved, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran. My heart pounded, my breath came in gasps, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Suddenly I tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. My flashlight tumbled from my hand, rolling away into the darkness. I reached for it, but before I could grab it, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I looked up, and those red eyes were right in front of me, watching me with a terrible, silent hunger. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to keep running, but it was too late. The last thing I saw was the creature's eyes, glowing like flames in the night. Before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I felt weightless and numb, as though floating in a dream. But I wasn't dreaming. I was hanging upside down, tied by my ankles to a tree branch. The forest spun around me, dark and blurry, and the cold night air stung my skin. I struggled, trying to twist myself free, but the ropes cut into my ankles. Panic took over as I remembered the creature, those red eyes, the way it had followed me without making a sound. My flashlight was gone, my camera was gone, and Jack was still missing. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something horrible. Jack's body, hanging upside down from another tree nearby, his face pale and still, his eyes open but empty. I wanted to scream, to call his name, but no sound would come out. It was like my voice had been stolen. A rustling sound came from behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't want to turn, but I couldn't help it. I twisted my neck as far as I could, and there, standing just a few feet away, was the creature. It was tall, its shape shrouded in shadows, but I could still see those red eyes, glowing faintly, watching me with a chilling calmness. The creature moved closer, and my heart pounded, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. I couldn't understand what it was, or why it had chosen us. All I knew was that there was no escape. By the time the park rangers found us the next morning, Jack and I were gone, our bodies torn apart, as if we'd been nothing more than prey. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened out there. They say it was just an animal attack, a freak accident. But I know the truth.